And so we are grateful that everyone can be with us today for our study in chapters 12 and 13. I want to just recognize as we begin chapters 12 and 13 that we are continuing what is a larger subsection of the book of 2 Corinthians, what we might think of as the third section of the book of 2 Corinthians. That would be chapters 10 through the end of the book, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And just to very quickly look at the material in chapter 10 and 11 by way of review, I've tried to make it easy on this summary slide. In chapter 10, Paul basically defends his ministry against some charges that were apparently being leveled by the opponents or the false apostles, the super apostles. We'll see another reference to them in chapter 12. He defends his ministry against at least three charges, just trying to summarize and make it a little easier to grasp. The charge that he is cowardly when he is among them, but he is very, very bold when he writes to them, and that there's a certain level of incongruity or a lack of integrity on his part because of the cowardice that he shows in his physical presence. Another area that perhaps was an accusation that he was in fact weak, and that he was butting in where he didn't belong, that he had put his nose into somebody else's business. So the charge of intrusion, the idea that we used in translating that section from some of the more contemporary translations of running in your own lane, staying in your lane, doing what God has called you to do. And in the midst of that, there are a number of references, depending on your translation, to the measure God has given or the field God has given, the particular measurement that's being used, the limit that God has given. All of those are coming out of the same basic concept, measuring themselves by themselves. So that would be a quick summary of chapter 10. That's his introduction. And it's rather third person and not too specifically focused. In chapter 11, he actually now comes to a comparison of his ministry with the ministry of his opponents, and it becomes more obvious that he is appealing directly to the Corinthians. One of the great accusations apparently was that he was ministering for money, and he defends his commitment to minister to the Corinthians without charge, actually saying that that distinguishes him from his opponents and is an evidence of his love for the Corinthian church. Two other areas of comparison in chapter 11 have to do with the reluctant boasting that we read about, chapter 11, verses 16 through 21, and then the continuation of that comparison, a list of some of the things that Paul had suffered for Christ, and finally the fact that he says that in whatever sufferings that he is mentioning, that he is actually suffering and now boasting about the things that are for him points of weakness. Excuse me. Out of that idea of ministry and humility, weakness, and concern for the maturity of the Corinthian church, we come to chapter 12 in our study today, and we come to realize that there's not really been as big a shift as we might think. Chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, is often cited and perhaps not always well understood. Throughout this section of 2 Corinthians, all four chapters, there's a fairly significant amount of sarcasm that Paul uses, and you kind of have to read some of the statements. They're not always perfectly translated. Some of the statements have to be read as a certain level of sarcasm. I also want to mention before we get into chapter 12 that there are a number of references throughout, some of them in our study today, that to me indicate the integrity of the book. That is, that this is not two or three different letters of Paul that have been put together by a later redactor or a later editor, but that there is a certain kind of continuity, a certain kind of integrity that makes the entire book hold together. So we come to chapter 12 and verse 1 through 6, and Paul is really still addressing the same subject he was addressing in chapter 11, and that is boasting by calling attention to weakness. I don't know that he's trying to make a big difference between visions and revelations in verse 1. I do think what he's referring to is direct revelation from God. It may well be that the false teachers were claiming special knowledge or some kind of special revelation. It's also possible that this section should be understood as a continuation of the problem with tongue speaking in the first letter. That some who were speaking in tongues or were interpreting, some who were being able to use the gift of miraculous prophecy or interpreting prophecies, that they were claiming direct revelation from God that set them apart from others of the Corinthians. But since he is specifically addressing the charges of the opposition, it seems to me most likely that the false teachers were claiming special knowledge or special revelation. The use of the third person when he says, I know or knew a man in Christ 14 years ago, that was a very typical rabbinical style. Paul is describing a person who is a Christian in Christ, something that had happened probably around the years 42 or 43 AD, if you just do the math on the date. The New Testament does not record a specific event from that time, but there are numerous references throughout the book of Acts and in Galatians 1 to Paul having visions from God, Acts 9, Acts 18, Acts 23, Acts 27. Of course, some of those would be after 2 Corinthians by point of time. Paul says in verse 2 that he did not know the details of what had happened, whether it was in the body or out of the body. He makes a distinction with a reference to the third heaven, which he also calls paradise. The way that was understood in the first century, the first heaven was the atmosphere. The second heaven was the place of the solar system or the stars, and the third heaven was the place where God dwelt. In chapter 12, verses 3 and 4, Paul somewhat restates what he has already said in verse 2. And he closes that by saying, and it depends on your translation, the NIV says things that are not permitted to tell. The ESV says things that are too sacred to be spoken. The original language simply says unspeakable speech. There's kind of an interesting word duplication, and you can hear it in the original language, unspeakable speech. So Paul really suggests in this no specific reason that it was unspeakable, but 4 reasons have been given. I've mentioned 2 of them, one in the NIV translation, what was not permitted to say, the idea of the ESV, things that were too sacred to speak. One of the most logical things, I think the way I understood it for a number of years, reading it in the King James Version, is that there just wasn't human vocabulary to describe the excellency and the amazing things that had happened in the visit to the third heaven. And a third possibility would be that they were simply quite overwhelming. Paul makes the point, regardless, in verses 5 and 6, that he is boasting only about weaknesses. I will boast about a man like that, even though I think he's referring to himself. I will boast about a man like that, but I would not boast about it from the standpoint of trying to call attention to self. If Paul were to boast, he would try to call attention to God and the fact that God revealed himself, and that it would not be focused on personal success. And so Paul's desire, in whatever reference to his weakness, was that God would be glorified. And of course, that brings us very easily then to the ideas that we probably know best out of chapter 12, that is beginning in verse 7. So this idea that I could become conceited because of such great revelations, Paul makes pretty clear he's talking about himself in verses 1 through 6. There was a thorn in the flesh that was given him, some kind of a painful, continual anguish physically. I think it's a misreading to think that the thorn was spiritual or emotional. There have been various maladies or difficulties physically suggested, including epilepsy and malaria. Probably one of the most frequently mentioned, and my favorite, has to do with an eye or vision problem that we could see referred to in Galatians 4 and Galatians 6. One author says that the vision problem could be related to his Damascus Road experience, which is kind of interesting, and there may have been some resulting level of blindness that came about as a result of that. Regardless, his thorn in the flesh constantly reminded him of his past life. He wished it to be taken away, but Paul had the same experience in his prayer that Jesus had in his prayer, according to Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7, and that is that the prayers were not answered as they wished. Both Jesus and Paul, the Bible speaks very clearly about prayers that were not answered according to what they would have wished. And so the reminder is for you and for me that God works in the midst of our lives, in the midst of the imperfections of our lives, in the midst of problems and pain to accomplish his purpose. Paul does note, as we continue to look at the text, that he received a response from the Lord, and that response was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And the way that Paul describes that response from God is in the perfect tense. So it reminds me of some of the game shows where the question is that your final answer? So when you read the perfect tense and you see it related to God's answer, if Paul was ever tempted to say, "Is that your final answer?" Perhaps he was tempted, since it says 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away. So I kind of almost hear Paul saying, "Is that your final answer?" as he brings it back to the throne of God again. And God saying, "Yes, that's my final answer." And that's kind of clear in the use of the perfect tense. The point being, as you see in chapter 12 and verse 10, Paul will boast about his weakness so that the power of Christ dwelling in him will be more evident. Which brings us to the next subsection of chapter 12. After Paul's thorn in the flesh and being made strong in the midst of his weakness, we have this reference to the super apostles. This short paragraph in verses 11, 12, and 13 connects Paul's thorn in the flesh weakness with the criteria that the super apostles were saying should be used to evaluate ministry. Paul writes that the Corinthians had forced him to commend himself when they should have been the ones commending him. I mean, I think that's a pretty good summary of what he's saying here, but he does mention again that if he had mistreated the Corinthian church, it would only be because he was willing to minister to them free of charge, that he was not in the least inferior, and that he was never a burden to them, verse 13. And that's one of the examples of sarcasm. Well, how were you inferior to the other churches? Except, well, I was never a burden to you. Forgive me if that is a way in which I wronged you. I never took any of your money. And if you feel wronged because of that, please forgive me. Verse 14, another paragraph that we'll sort out. Maybe that's not the way Paul would have done it, but it's the way I've done it for our study. Paul is again expressing his concern. He's willing to spend and be spent for them. Paul will love them more, hoping that they will reciprocate and that they will love him more, even though he recognizes that perhaps they will love him less. Verse 15. He adds again, somewhat sarcastically, in verses 16 and 17, well, since I'm such a crafty person, maybe I caught you by deceit. Maybe I took you in. But he responds very quickly to say, no, I have not taken advantage of you, and those that I have sent to work with you have not taken advantage of you. It's a rhetorical question. Titus did not exploit you, did he? The question expects a response, and that is no, he did not. And finally, in verse 18, Paul mentions the previous visit of Titus, accompanied by the other brother Paul had sent. The point is that Paul had not taken any advantage of the Corinthians. He was concerned about them. He hadn't taken their money. He was looking forward to coming back to them. And again, remember, in the whole context, Paul is defending his delay in the visit, the plan that we began reading about in chapter 1 and verse 12. So now he explains in verses 19 through 21, the reason for his delay is he wants them to develop their own faith. He wants them to strengthen themselves spiritually in a mature way. He reaffirms his great desire to strengthen them even as he is defending himself. He affirms once again his truthfulness in God's sight in this section, reminding us perhaps of the same kind of phrasing in 2:17, in the sight of God, but he wants to give them time to correct their lives. Verse 20, I'm afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want me to be. And he specifically mentions areas he hopes they can fix. Their quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, factions, slander, gossip, arrogance, disorder. And if he finds them not yet having corrected these matters, he's afraid that he will be somewhat embarrassed in all of that. So Paul would not rejoice in the lack of repentance. He would be humiliated because he has been boasting about them in the past, and he would mourn over those who had sinned and had not yet repented. So that brings us through the first chapter of our 2 chapters that we're talking about today. Really not too difficult a chapter. Kind of what you see is what you get. But there are some interesting connections. The whole theme, again, the idea of ministry in the midst of humility, in the midst of weakness, boasting not about special things that one might boast about, but always evidencing his concern for the Corinthians, and especially his concern for their maturity. Now that call for maturity continues into chapter 13. We kind of come to what we could call some final admonitions. Paul makes clear that once the facts are correctly established with the biblical principle of 2 or 3 witnesses, that he will not hesitate to do whatever is necessary, thinking back to the accusation that he is cowardly or weak when he is among them. But Paul wants them to deal with their own problems. There is a kind of an interesting thing we'll come to in the last 3 or 4 verses that depending on your translation might be of help. So we come to 13:1. This will be my 3rd visit to you. There's no biblical account of Paul's 2nd visit, which I would characterize as a painful visit based on chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. It looks as though during that visit, Paul had spared no one as he corrected the church, and that had caused him pain and sorrow, and also pain and sorrow for the Corinthians. And now he promises that his 3rd visit could well be equal to the 2nd if there is still a need for correction. He's really just restating in 13:1 through 3 what he had already written in 12:14 through 16. He wants the Corinthians to deal with their problems before his arrival so he will not be forced to do it. In 13:4, he makes the point, Christ was crucified in weakness, yet lives by God's power. Likewise, we are weak in him, and we live with him by God's power to serve you. Christ's crucifixion may be seen as weakness, at least from a human point of view. And Paul and those with him follow the same model. They are followers of Christ. The result of obeying the will of God is clearly seen in the example of Christ. Christ now lives because of God's power, and Paul repeatedly affirms that he is weak so that God can be shown to be strong, and he affirms that when he is weak from a human vantage point, that is the time that he is in fact the strongest spiritually. Finally, we come to the primary part of chapter 13, that is verses 5 through 10. Very interesting. He says, examine yourselves. He uses the word earlier that they should be testing themselves, or sometimes it's translated tempting. Test yourselves to see if you're in the faith. And then you have the idea of proving yourselves as we move on into this section. Examine yourselves, test yourselves, and then they will be able to know that Jesus Christ is within them. He believes the Corinthians will also realize that Paul and his companions do not fail the test. In verses 7 and 8 of chapter 13, Paul restates his goal of ministry among the Corinthians, praying that the Corinthians will do what is right, or that they will not do anything wrong. I think that looking at his intent, that probably I get a clearer sense of what Paul is saying when I translate it to say that they will do what is right. That's the positive way of saying that you will not do anything wrong. But the NIV translates verse 7, I pray to God that you will not do anything wrong. His goal was not only their spiritual strength, but also their maturity, so that they would be equipped and complete, or perfect, if you will. And it's the same word that's used, or in the root of it is used in Ephesians 4:12, to perfect the saints. Also that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished to every good work, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 17. The point is that Paul's weakness released and made visible God's spiritual power. So verse 9, we are glad when we are weak and you are strong, but our prayer is for your complete perfection, or equipping, your completeness. And then in the final section, the final greetings, I love this summary, and it's really easy to miss some of what's here. In verse 11, we have 5 imperatives. He says, aim for perfection. I'm reading from the NIV. Aim for perfection, listen to my appeal, be of one mind, and live in peace. So we have rejoice, as we see what's here. In this text, we have rejoice, be complete, be encouraged, agree, and live in peace. If people can do this, if these 5 characteristics are present in the life of a Christian or the life of a church, this would be an interesting beginning point to summarize a sermon over 2 Corinthians. If you were just going to try to preach 2 Corinthians or teach in one Bible class or one sermon, here they are. This is God's antidote for unhappiness and selfishness, discouragement, disagreements, disunity, and conflicts. He just simply says that life should be filled with joy, equipped for serving others, encouraging and encouraged, united in the gospel, and peacemakers. And then just let me mention real quickly, not that it matters too much, but I do want to mention that there are 4 verses that close the letter, 11, 12, 13, 14. But some English translations, and it depends on your translation, actually combine 12 and 13 into one verse. So then the last verse of the book is 13 instead of 14. So sometimes you'll be reading a commentary or a Bible study guide, and it'll be a reference to 2 Corinthians 13:13, and they'll quote, "May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you." And you think, wait a minute, my Bible says that's 13:14. What's going on? How can it be 13:13? I mention that because in my early memory work, and this is going back a long time now, 50 years, but in my early memory work, that well-known Trinitarian close in 2 Corinthians was 13:13. And that's when I did my first memory work, I knew 2 Corinthians 13:13 was this wonderful grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, love of God, fellowship of the Holy Spirit. Well, I've had to adjust because now I normally, when I quote it, say it's 13:14. So that's just kind of, those things are interesting to me. When he says all the saints send their greeting in verse 13 now, that may refer to Paul and those traveling with him, or he could be referring to some of the churches that he had visited. We know, of course, that saints refers to people who are Christians, members of the church. And so that kind of gives us a quick look, an overview of what's going on in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, chapter 13. Would be wonderful to have the opportunity to share responses to questions, but with the video that's not possible. So we welcome those of you who are with us live in the class to stay online, be with us, and we'll talk about it more. But for those of you who have joined us only with the video recording, we're thankful to be able to study the text with you. Thank you so much for being a part of the study. I encourage you to go back and look at the previous videos. We've tried to put together a resource that'll be helpful in understanding the message of the book of 2 Corinthians. May God bless us as we seek to know his will.